Yesterday, right? Well, no, I was busy, that happened.
What he's doing, when you get noticed.
Yeah.
Scaring off participants.
I'm Carolyn. Okay,
Perfect,
Carolyn.
well.
Maybe you can't be sound.
Perfect, well.
You bought the book?
Perfect. You have a nice-
Good.
I think that's a lot of benefits for children. Have to either that high school or that. Yeah.
How are you?
Nice to see you. It's not like it's like trying to purchase.
By the way, we're sending out a special invitation for November the seventh, whatever that Friday is, for veterans, as we talked about. Good, glad to hear that. Taught some narrative today. Great. Not yet. They find out in a few weeks what their final placement. They're still in their training place. So the training placement is good, it's just happening.
It's good to start off happy.
Oh, yeah. All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you for our third of 4 installments of our exploration of the emerging thought of Rabbi Dr. Michael Marmur, who will be our scholar and guest in what better turn it on. Michael will be here the first Shabbat of November. So November the 1st, after you come out of your Halloween stupor, there will be not only Torah study at 9:30, but our November monthly morning minyan will be that Saturday, the 1st. And then the following weekend, on the 7th, Friday night, Rabbi Marmur will be here as part of his scholar in residence, so that he will be speaking at services, which are at 6 p.m. that night, followed by a dinner, which you can choose to register for. The dinner will be great and the learning will be even better. So we encourage you to sign up for that.
What time the dinner will start?
The dinner is going to start when services are over. Which is 7:15.
That's on the 5th, Rabbi?
7.
On the 7th.
So on Tuesday, November 4th, we start.
Tuesday, November 4th.
Lunch and learn.
I believe there is a new lunch and learn that is starting that Tuesday.
All right, I'm confused. He's at the Minion on the 1st. He's
No.
staying a week.
No, there's just mini,
Oh,
if you want to go to mini.
Oh.
He's coming the following, but when I said the first weekend in November, I didn't want people to be confused, because it's confused.
I'm confused.
You were confused?
Yeah.
This is why we're talking about it.
I was like confused when you said it first. Okay, got it.
Now we're happy, okay? How about we do this, November 7th and 8th? Okay, will be when Rabbi Marmur will be here, he will be speaking at services. And following services more extensively after Shabbat dinner. And then, that's why we want you to sign up for the dinner, because then you get fed, and then on a nice full tummy, you'll have time for Rabbi Marmur to be able to share more extensively. The other thing is, when you share only during services, you can only do an itty bitty bit. We want him to have the opportunity to share more extensively with us. And then he will also be teaching on Saturday morning, November the 8th. Okay, as our scholar in residence for that weekend. So encourage you to please make plans for that as well. Okay, also at the service on November the 7th, we will be honoring veterans. So if you are a veteran or if you know someone who is a veteran, please encourage them to come to services that night for a special honor for US veterans. And we're have the opportunity as part of Veterans Day commemorations to show appreciation. Any good and welfare? Today is my daughter's 22nd birthday. Kelly is 22 on the 22nd. Or what do they call it, your golden birthday or whatever? The fancy.
Like a lot.
So I'm celebrating her birthday with you and her mother is celebrating her birthday with her. Everybody works. So,
Is she in Israel now?
no, she's in Washington DC. The other golden Indian. Okay, so as we get ready to begin, two quick questions to see what we remember from previous sessions. Question number one is, what is modern Jewish thought? Yes, Marilyn.
Incorporate Buddhism in the modern world.
How do you weave together the tradition of Judaism with the modern world in which we live? How do you marry those two things together? How do you develop ways of thinking about Judaism that incorporate the wisdom and the understandings that emerge out of modernity while staying true to tradition? Can anyone give me an example of a way in which Judaism had to wrestle with some of the ideas and ideals of modernity? Yes, Karen.
We drive to Shabbat services.
Okay, what do you do when you live in a time that the ancient rabbis could never have imagined, where people can live 20 miles away from each other and still think of themselves in the same community? Right, 20 miles was a day's journey in ancient times. The idea that someone who lived 20 miles away as being part of your community would have not been part of the idea that those folks would have understood. So now when you have this piece of technology that can allow you to feel closer, how do you avail yourself of it? Should you avail yourself of it? Good. What's another idea that came out of, yeah, Andrew?
How do we deal with like chosen people?
What does it mean to be a chosen people when we recognize the inherent worth in every human being? Right? If we really believe in equality and we really believe in those ideas, right, that the idea of individual worth, how can you say that one people is more beloved by God than another? Okay, so that's a big thing to wrestle with. Good. What's another thing?
I could refer you to Rabbi Esha, as you stated, his radical amazement. What is God, or something of that nature? Did you wrap it up in that?
We talked a little bit about that last time, right?
Yeah.
That part of the way that Heschel deals with this is by looking at his ancestors' thoughts, right? Which is, whoops, I'm not sure where that came from. Get rid of that. Was to sort of look at the mystical underpinnings of Judaism and to say one of the answers to the spiritual depletion that comes from living in the industrial age is to continue to cultivate that sense of gratitude and amazement. But there's a very strange phenomenon at this table that you have taken for granted, which is what?
That.
Well, there's that, but more than that. Yeah, there's women here.
Yeah.
What the hell are y'all doing here? Why would you think that you have just the same right as women to study at the same table as Aaron and Alan and Dervana and Robert and me? Because we believe women are equal, right? You all are sitting here at this table like, duh, what are even you doing here, right? And the answer is that because modernity said not only are all people equal, that means women are equal. How do you weave that into a misogynist Jewish tradition that looked at women as sitting on the periphery of public life and men in the core of public life? So there's a million different ways that we think about this. So that's question number one. You answered it very well. Question number two is, who are the two major Jewish thinkers that impact Rabbi Marmur. There were two of them. Let's see if we can remember any. Bobby, you got one? Horowitz?
And, just on the tip of my tongue, was it in Heschel?
Heschel. Borowitz and Heschel, right? So Borowitz taught this idea of covenantal theology. Covenantal theology, I don't need to be sharing this screen, I can look at you all.
And he could have included Rabbi Rashi 1,000 years ago, who had dissenting that women and men should have equal say in opinions.
Well, he did not quite the same as it came out in the modern period, but he was famous for having ensured that his daughters had a Torah education. So that's true, Jerome. But when we think about Borowitz has this idea, okay, that yes, we are autonomous individuals, which means the locus of authority for our moral judgments is not out there, it's in here. But at the same time, we are obligated from an autonomous place to impose on ourselves the moral dictates of the covenant of Israel. And so the idea is that living in the covenant, yes, we have a choice whether or not to live under it, but we are obligated by a sense of duty as members of that covenant to live by it, which sounds not so different from what a modern Orthodox Jew would say, right? But the difference is, if I'm a traditional Jew pre-modernity, why do I do what the Torah says?
Why do you deal with what?
Why do I do what the Torah says?
You'd be ostracized from the community.
No.
You
Well, you would be, but that's not the reason you do it.
Amen.
God told you to.
Yeah. Yeah.
God told you to. So you do what God tells you to. Has anything changed? Only the place where we hear God talk to us. Right? So pre-modernity, God is outside there and commands you using the fancy word heteronymous, right? From the outside. Modernity presents the idea that actually God commands you from the inside. This is the debate between Reformed Jews and Orthodox Jews, which is, where does that authority lie? Okay? And then Heschel comes along and says, actually, two things. One is, I have to continually work to scratch my mystical itch, right? I have to try to cultivate that sense of radical amazement, let the Judaism not simply live in my head, but in my heart. And that if it really does sit in my heart the way it's supposed to, what should that do? Propel me into action, which is why Heschel wrote so much about the prophets, and why he himself, especially during the period of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, felt that his Judaism wasn't sufficient to be taught in the halls of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. He had to, as he said, pray with his feet. Actually, he didn't say it that way. He said, my feet were praying, when he was walking with Dr. King and Son. So using that as a background, in the introduction to his book, he has 5 sort of elements that are going to be the underpinning of how he's going to share his theology. And that's what we're going to look at today. We'll see how far we get. Okay, so let's see if I can make this work. Okay, those 5 themes are anxiety and hope, crunchy and smooth Jewish theology. The reason why he employs an alphabetical structure to the book. Who was Moses Mendelssohn, and why? What does it mean that Judaism is a living script? And then we'll talk a little bit about the Masoretes. The likelihood that we're going to get to all of this today is low, but the likelihood that we will finish all of it in the next 2 classes is medium. Okay, but the idea is to see if we can conquer all of this material. Okay, it gets a little, if you see like we're spending a lot of time on the first couple of bullet points, that's because there's more meat there in his introduction than some of these other pieces. But the idea is, hopefully, if we can get through a lot of this week and the beginning of next class, then we can look at one of the ways he explores one of the letters, just to get a sense. And he's going to give us some of the letters, that's what he's gonna be teaching, so I just need to tee it up because he's gonna be here teaching a few different letters. From his book, when he's here. Yeah, Lauren.
Going back to the differences between men and women and the thought involved, I guess, post pre-modernity. I guess, you know, the men and the women couldn't really learn together, but I saw it more as, or what I learned was it was more of the man's role to learn. But it was because also if the women weren't inferior, it was more like they knew, they kind of like knew. And the
It's a
men,
very modern apology that is often offered in Chabad circles
yes.
to make women feel
Feel
better for being sequestered from the. Okay,
Right.
so that notion is a response to the modern pressures of women's egalitarianism. So they say, oh, no, you're just already better.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay, and if that makes you feel better, it goes into hate, but right, it's not, no, it's not so far, right? They didn't draw that out of nowhere. But the fact was that pre-modernity, and certainly still in those unmodern worlds that still live today, there are very, very clearly defined gender roles in society, and women's roles are in the private sphere, and men's role are in the public sphere. So men needed to learn because that was public stuff. Women needed to learn too, but what they needed to learn was not that. Right? Women needed to learn about family purity laws. Women needed to learn about keeping a kosher home. Women needed to learn about the domestic sphere, but they didn't need to know about what happens when you find a lost object. They didn't have to study the intricacies of Jewish law. They certainly didn't need to know about most of ritual life, except as it extended to the home. Because that wasn't their place. The public sphere was where men, and so there that is. Okay. So why does anxiety produce Jewish theology? So let's talk, what is anxiety?
Fear.
There's a fear factor that comes with anxiety, lack of control,
Not at rest.
not at rest,
Worry.
worry,
Yeah. Worry of the unknown.
worry of the unknown. Uh-huh. Okay. And when things are not resolved, right, there's anxiety. So I'll give you an example. We're trying to decide whether we take a vacation during one of the sort of winter holiday weeks when our youngest was home from college. We don't need to plan anything for the middle one because she's halfway around the world. And the big one is off in the working world and he's living his life. So we're trying to decide what to do. And one thought was, let's take a cruise. And the reason why we thought to take a cruise is because if you live in South Florida, taking a cruise is easy. You don't have to get on a flight, you can just drive down to the boat, and once you're on the boat, you don't have to worry about anything. And all the taken care of, there's some entertainment you can do as much or as little as you feel like, and who cares what port the boat goes to because they're all the same anyway. Right? However, our youngest is like, I don't know if I want to go on a cruise with you guys for a week. I mean, that's a lot of parent time. And we went, and so we haven't made a decision about which cruise to go on and whether to go, or maybe we do something else. And because it's unresolved, we're sitting with this anxiety because we didn't book anything yet. And of course, the longer we wait to book, the more the prices are going to go up. So whether we go or we don't go, these are, first world problems. There's anxiety in the system because it's unresolved. Okay? Women and men have a lot of anxiety because they are shifting their gender roles from what used to be very hard and fast gender roles in society. So when you aren't sure what your place is, that creates anxiety. Am I allowed to do this? Am I not allowed to do this? Am I welcome in this space? Am I not welcome in this space? right? So when things are not resolved, for whatever the reason is, they're not resolved, right? That's anxiety, right? When do you have stress dreams?
Would you what?
When do you wake up having a stress dream?
The night before something major is gonna happen.
The night before something major is gonna happen because it hasn't happened yet.
Right.
Right? Anybody here, what's your favorite stress dream? Mine is like, I'm at a convention, but I don't know what room I'm supposed to be in, and I'm late, and I don't, and everything, or I'm gonna miss my flights, right? Or I can't get to the airport in time, like, those are the stress dreams. We all have these dreams, right? And that's why Andrea has a lucrative business as a psychotherapist, helping people resolve their stress dreams. And there are other things. But, right, so anxiety is when you have these things that are in conflict and it's not resolved. Okay? So Borowitz says, if you reject the metaphysical assumptions of traditional authority claims, which is a fancy way of saying what?
Not for me.
Say it again.
It's not for me. What the authority wants is not for me.
When it's not for me.
Yeah.
Now, why do I say that it's not for me? Because I'm modern, I get to choose. Right? So if I reject the idea that the Torah came from Sinai and God gave it to you and that's why you have to do it, and I reject that, can I still find a foundation or a rationale for perpetuating being Jewish at all? Right? So the premise of Judaism is, at Sinai, God established a covenant with Israel and gave us the Torah. You get to the rabbinic period, and they say it wasn't just the written Torah that God gave us. What else did God give us? The oral Torah, just as binding. They needed it to be just as binding because they were the ones writing it. So if that, and that's been, somebody actually just recently wrote a really stupid article. Do you all know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is?
No.
The Dunning-Kruger effect, Andrea knows what the Dunning-Kruger effect is. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the psychological phenomenon where the less you know about something, the more confident you are in what you know. So some schnook wrote some article on some page that somebody shared on a WhatsApp group that I'm on, basically saying Reform Judaism is another religion. It's not Judaism. Why? Because Judaism is God commanded it at Sinai and you do it. And Reform Jews say, well, maybe I will, maybe I won't, blah, 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 blah. And it's not Judaism anymore. And then in his smarmy, self-satisfied way, writes at the end of the article, we're here when you're ready to come home. Thank you very much, right? My idea of going back to that pre-modern sensibility with that infantile pediatric theology of the big bald bearded fuzzy in the sky that deals out service cards depending on how well you behave, or like Shabbat candles, I don't want to come home to that, right? So, but Borowitz is asking the fundamental questions. Well, if not that, is there a Judaism? And the answer is, well, sure. So what's the biggest thing that drives Jewish people into anxious fits is, will there be a Jewish future?
Yes.
What did Alan Dershowitz call us? The ever-dying people.
Yes.
Right? How many people had apoplectic conversations 30 years ago when the Pew study came out saying, 52% of Jews are intermarrying, and everyone Shride Gewalt, there's never going to be a Jewish future. Right? Everyone's always worried about a Jewish future. This is not new. Okay? So Philo, 2,000 years ago, was also worried about whether there'd be a Jewish future, but his concerns were somewhat more immediate and existential. Why? Because they're living under the Romans. Okay? So Caligula becomes the Caesar. And King Agrippa of Judea is trying to deal with his paranoia. So what does Caligula think to do so that people don't lose sight of his divinely ordained Caesarhood? I don't know if that's a word, but I made it. He says, I'm gonna put a statue of me in Herod's beautiful temple in Jerusalem. Agrippa is Herod's grandson. Okay? Well, what do you think the Jews would do if somebody in 38 CE, if the Caesar put a statue of himself in the temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem?
They would like it.
It's not that they wouldn't like it.
Yeah.
Tear it down. They would tear it down and they would revolt. Right? 30 years later, they did revolt anyway. But not over that. It was over other things, right? So he actually tries to work with Caligula to not do that because he's worried about a Jewish future. Okay? Jonathan Sacks writes a book, the late chief rabbi of Great Britain. Will we have Jewish grandchildren?
That's my.
Right? So this conflict
That's
between
my.
your question is, are we gonna have Jewish grandchildren?
Yes, am I gonna have Jewish friends?
So this is, so you're anxious, right?
Yes.
Right? So that anxiety says, well, all right, how can I ensure that we have Jewish grandchildren? Well, the question then becomes, is there a theology or a way of being Jewish that would be inspiring and meaningful to folks who don't want to surrender their modern, or now what we would call postmodern commitments, right? But it's that conflict between modern autonomy and traditional Jewish concepts of covenant that are creating anxiety. This was true 1,000 years ago, right? Saja Gaon writes, I saw in this age of mine, this is the 10th century, this is the 900s, right? I saw in this age of mine many believers whose belief was not pure. I saw furthermore men who were sunk, as it were, in seas of doubt, and there was no diver to bring them up from the depths. I thought that it was my duty to help them therewith and my obligation to direct them to the truth. So even 1,000 years ago, people were like, I'm not sure I believe in that. Now, the pressures of what they didn't believe were different, right? But the idea of people falling away from Jewish tradition is long in story. And so what has to happen in those days and ages is there need to be compelling Jewish answers that say, well, don't drift away, because look how good this is, right? Why in last week's Torah portion does Adam and Eve eat the fruit? Well, you've read the story. Why do they eat the fruit? Yeah.
Knowledge.
Not knowledge.
They were tempted. Desire, yeah.
No, they were independently deciding what they wanted to do.
Well, they were, right? It looked delicious,
Good.
right? So they said, it looks delicious. I think I'll have a bite. So if Judaism can be made to look more delicious, maybe people will bite on it a little harder and eat more of it.
Isn't
Yeah.
that how Christianity came about? It looked more delicious than the current Judaism that was there.
Well, that's how it got stronger. It came about because of a Gnostic belief in the imminent coming of Messiah after dealing with the imposition of the Romans.
It was that time period, right?
No,
Now, when-
that was about 900 years before that.
Oh,
Okay, so in the 20th century, there was a French philosopher whose name was Emmanuel Levinas. And Levinas said that in the 20th century, which is the height of the modern period, he's writing in the 50s mostly, and the 60s. There's three anxieties that Jews are facing. One is, will we survive? Okay. Why would Jews in the 1950s be asking that question? Right? And all of the pressures on Judaism of assimilation in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The second is what also happened in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The state of Israel was born. And so the initial birth of the state of Israel was not a religious revival, it was a socialist revival, right? The early founders of the state of Israel were not particularly religious people. They allowed for religious people, but they were not led by religious people. So in the 50s, what's the most powerful party in Israel? Mapai, right? The Labor Party. That's not a religious party, right? So he asks, will the Jewish future after we settle the land of Israel be recognizable and desirable? In other words, is there even going to be a Judaism? Which is kind of, you look at what the parties in power in Israel look like today, Levinas would be scratching his head at that one. And then, with this question, which is a question that we are grappling with today, is the moral price of sovereignty too high?
Are we
And
talking about
these-
Israel in that one?
What's that?
Who's the sovereignty meaning?
The state of Israel.
Yeah.
Based on what it takes in order, now remember, this is pre-67 he's writing these things, right? So add to that all the complexities after 67, when the Palestinian population in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and also various other Arab communities in the Sinai, and Druze and other communities in the north, up in the Golan, become our responsibility.
The answer is yes.
So as, Aaron.
Yeah, and, the author, his name is Marmur, yeah, he says that for him personally, not only sovereignty, but now that he really values living in Israel, living in Jerusalem. He sees what's going on, he really wonders if it's sustainable. Wait,
Yeah, so,
non-Jewish
so there are lots of people
citizens even.
Right.
Yeah.
who are trying to figure out what is going to be the Jewish quality of this Jewish state.
Well, not only that, but the way that citizens of the state who are Jewish will be treated.
Yes, right? And what do you do with the 20 to 25% of the citizenry who are not Jewish? And then what do you do with all of these non-citizens that you administer in the aftermath of 1967? So as he says, this presents a bear hunt answer. Does everyone know the
Yes.
song "Going on a Bear Hunt"? Right? Can't go over it, can't go under it, can't go around it, must go through it. So he's saying that to answer these questions, we can't evade these questions. We have to answer them. We have to work through them. Gives you a sense of his playful sense of humor, where he says the answer to these great Jewish philosophical questions is enshrined in the great wisdom of the bear hunt summer camp, right? And so his project is to work through these anxieties, right? So the conflict of modern Judaism, right, is this balance of right versus true. So one way to decide whether something is right is that it's defensible, it's plausible, it's sound, it's right. But is it true is a different question, which is, does that induce a passionate commitment? Is it teachable? Is it resonant? What's the difference in these two conceptions when you think about how do I live, how do I establish a modern Judaism? Yeah.
One is on paper and the other is more practical. in
Okay.
Interpretation,
Potentially, right? Right, there's the theory and the reality. Good, what else? Yeah, well,
Kind of interesting how Rabbi Marmur said that he wouldn't perform a wedding of a Jewish person to a non-Jewish person. But he feels that is, I think he said this,
Rabbi
right,
Horowitz.
Horowitz,
Mhm.
sorry. But he saw the rationality or felt that he believed it, but he didn't want to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so, the conflict between something that's right versus something that's true, right, has to do with the covenant itself, right? So if I take on all of the truths, all of the, right, ideals of modernity, I may end up with a Judaism that's not so much fun, or that's not compelling, or that's unlikely to induce, as he says, a passionate commitment. That's not inspiring, right? So the challenge of a modern Judaism is to figure out, how do you have a Judaism that is right, but at the same time compelling? So he describes this as like two chariots pulling in opposite directions. So one is, what happens to Judaism if it becomes universal, right? If the, right, because one of the great values of modernity was universals, the breaking down of distinction. Give me an example of how modernity breaks down distinction. Yeah.
I can go up on the beam as a female.
Okay, right, that we don't distinguish the rights in public space between the
I
genders.
can hold the tone.
Okay, good. Name another phenomenon of the 20th century that broke down barriers and distinctions. Yeah,
We accept that other religions are valid, that we all have our own paths. And Judaism isn't the be all and the end all.
right, that we allow for the truths that come out of other traditions. You might say the European Union, right? The European Union is a decidedly modern thing, because they say these boundaries between Belgium and Luxembourg and Liechtenstein and France and Germany are not useful. We should be able to cross those borders without wondering, and I can walk around with a European Union passport, and I can cross those borders without distinction, right? Where did we see the pushback against that universalizing idea?
Currency with the Brits.
Okay, well, you see Brexit, right, that say, no, actually, we are distinct.
Right.
You see it in former Yugoslavia, right, which used to be one country and now is several, because they say, no, actually, we are distinct, because some of us are Serbian, and some of us are Croats, and some of us are Bosnians, and some of us, as my daughter will tell you, are North Macedonians. They wouldn't call themselves North Macedonians, they call themselves Macedonians and Albanians. But Greece didn't like the fact that their northern province, which was also called Macedonia, was going to be used by this country, so they made them use the word North Macedonia in the title of their country, because their country is newer than Greece. But similarly, right, you saw, and what do we call this? The Balkanization, right? Because you see all these little independencies. Why does that matter for Judaism? Because on the one hand, what did Jews do in the modern period? They wanted to be just like everybody else. And what's the problem? For 2,000 years, we were the people who were decidedly not like everybody else. We didn't pray the way everybody else did. We didn't speak the language that everybody else did. We didn't wear the clothes or our hair in the way that everybody else did. We were distinct. If any of you ever read Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews? Great book by Dara Horn, the novelist. And her contention is that the problem with Holocaust education and the education of anti-Semitism in the last 30 years is that the idea is you shouldn't hate Jewish people because they're like everybody else. And her contention is no. You shouldn't hate Jewish people because they're distinct, right? The reason why we shouldn't be hated is because it should be permissible for people to be distinct, to have their own individual identity. And it's okay. So at the same time, what's the problem if you pump up your pride over your individual identity? You become a chauvinist and a bigot. Enter Bezalel Smotrich, right? Or Ben-Gvir, right? Who say, I'm here and I'm in the land of Israel, and my distinctiveness is the only thing that matters, which means that Palestinian Arabs or Palestinian Christians have no rights here. We're seeing this in the America First debate between liberals and conservatives in America. How do you figure this piece of it out? And so he talks about the difference between a thick Judaism and a thin Judaism. So when you think about thick and thin, right? What image comes to mind?
And it's more easily breakable.
Thin is more easily breakable. Think of soup, right? A thin soup doesn't have much to it, right? So how would you define a thin Judaism?
Someone who goes to services on the high holy days only.
Okay, a thin Judaism is one where it is not practiced with much passion or energy. There isn't much capacity to educate, inculcate, perpetuate. You have not only the existence of Jewish illiteracy, but the permission to be Jewishly illiterate, and in fact, in some places, a celebration of it, right? Where Judaism is, what you know of it is superficial or trite, right? And that there is no understanding and ignorance of the classical texts and sources of Judaism, right? So someone who practices a thin Judaism may or may not observe Shabbat with any frequency, maybe, as Bobby says, show up for a few holidays or not, right? If you want to read a really interesting critique of thin Judaism, Sarah Hurwitz's first book, it was always there, I'm trying to remember what the title was, is about the fact that here's this Harvard educated, extremely bright, she was Michelle Obama's speechwriter, she had this very interesting career, and she was Jewish, and she said, but like, we went to synagogue till I was 13, and then we stopped going, and we didn't do anything, and maybe it was lox and bagels and whatever, I didn't know anything, and I was kind of proud, I would laugh about it. Like how Jews are the people who are a little noxious, right? Yeah.
Rabbi Schiff just had a dialogue with her on Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
It was really interesting. It was about her new book.
Yeah, her new book is also.
And she was everything that I believe in and what I've done to try to educate myself so that my kids would be educated and not stop their education after they were confirmed. And she was phenomenal.
Yeah, and what she talks about is how the Judaism that she practiced into her 30s was thin. There wasn't much there. But a thin Judaism, right? How many of you are proud to serve thin soup to your guests when they come to your house, right? So Menachem Kellner writes the following. He says, the critical question we face in the modern period is not whether we will have Jewish grandchildren, but how many different sorts of mutually exclusive, mutually intolerant Judaisms our grandchildren will face. Where are we seeing evidence of an intolerant Judaism?
On the college campuses?
On college campuses where they say, my Judaism has to be devoid of Zionism, which in and of itself is a postmodern idea, that you could divorce the Jewish people from the Jewish religious practice, because Jewish religious practice, apart from the peoplehood, is a modern invention, right? In order for Judaism to live in the West, in America specifically, you had to sort of separate it from the peoplehood piece, because Jews were trying to prove that they were American or French or German like everybody else. So they say, well, if you're really French, can you still be Jewish? And the answer is, yeah, it's just a religion. But that's brand new in the history of ideas. This idea that I could take my right? It's interesting, Dara Horn, this beautiful, if you want to listen to something very interesting, there's a podcast by a guy named Haviv Reddick Gur called Ask Haviv Anyway. Haviv is the son of a friend of mine, but he's also a very well known American Israeli journalist, and he has really great insights into sort of what's going on in Israel. But he interviewed Dara Horn recently to talk about anti-Semitism and to talk about this growing phenomenon. Their dialogue is really, really fascinating. So you have this idea that there could be a Judaism without the Jewish people, which is a brand new idea.
I don't understand.
Not without the Jewish people.
I don't understand that.
You don't understand or you don't believe it?
I don't understand what you're saying.
Without the
That there be a Judaism without the Jewish people.
Shabbat, Passover, Shavuos, no Israel.
Have you heard about the humanistic Judaism?
All right, so humanistic Judaism is a Judaism without God, which in and of itself is its own other thing, right? So, what's another intolerant Judaism?
Can I just ask a question? Because during the period of Soviet Union, the Jews, Soviet Jewry, Jews had to basically assimilate to the point of losing their Judaism. And a lot of them came out of that period as, you know, not related to anything Jewish. Is that what you're talking about?
No, it's actually the reverse, right? So what happened in the former Soviet Union is Jews were a people denuded of their ritual life,
Right,
right?
but then they,
If you looked on their passports, it said Jewish. But if you said Shabbat, Bar Mitzvah, Passover, we don't do that. We can't do that. No one taught us how to do that. So the other intolerant Judaisms, of course, are the ones that look at modern Judaism, like Reform, Conservative, and so forth, and say, you're not Jewish, right? Which you sometimes hear from some of the ultra-Orthodox in and around the world or in Israel, right? So the establishment of the state of Israel, yeah, Aaron, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think because you're saying Judaism without a Jewish people, you mean Judaism without a Jewish state.
homeland.
Because one intolerance is in Israel, there are people who say diaspora doesn't really count. They're not here.
No, it's actually without Jewish people. Because not only do they reject the state of Israel, they reject Jews that don't think exactly like they think. So I don't need to know about those people. I don't need to care about those people. I don't need to contribute to a federation to ensure that those people have somewhere to live or something to eat. My job is to find my own personal spiritual community that edifies me, and that's the extent of my Judaism.
Yeah, okay, but there are people who say, you know, some people are very learned, you know, some extreme, but also scholars who say, you know, diaspora is really where it's at, that the Jewish people existed without the state for a long time.
Yeah, and how'd that go?
Well, how's it going now? Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know, but
Still
there is, I mean, there is the intolerance against Jews who don't live in Israel, among some Jews who do live in Israel.
There's all kinds of intolerances, right? Orthodox versus modern, Israeli versus diaspora, there's all kinds of, and so that's a challenge, right? That theology has to answer. The state of Israel, establishment is the most consequential event that's happened to the Jewish people in over 1,000 years. And the question is, are we as a people up to those challenges? And what are those challenges? Well, one is we're surrounded by a lot of implacable enemies, right? Who even after 2 years of war say the only reason we decided to sign this ceasefire is so that we could regroup and attack again.
Yeah.
Right? We don't really have a good vision as to how Jews and Palestinians should live with or alongside each other in security and dignity. Here you see Marmur's Heschel side coming out, right? Because this really is gnawing at him. That the Judaism he practices doesn't just need to be spiritually enervating, it has to be morally compelling. And then the erosion that we see around the world in America and Israel of commitments to democracy. Where you're seeing, he's writing about Israel, but you could say the same for other Western democracies. There was already comfort in non-Western places with inequality and disenfranchisement, but we're starting to get a little more comfortable with that. And economic enough, right? Yes.
When I saw one of the bullet points, I'm thinking of all the Israelis that protested for over a couple of years, every Shabbat, whenever they went, thousands, tens of thousands.
Yeah, he was one of them.
Trying to bring that consciousness of democracy back to Israel, so it's there, it's present, it's not lost.
Oh, for sure,
Yeah.
but it's not settled.
Okay.
And the reason why you know it's not settled is because Yariv Levin is still the Minister of Justice of Israel, and he has not let go of his dream of the judicial reforms that were roiling Israel 3 years ago.
But there will be election, I think that.
There may be an election coming up,
Oh,
right? And
in Israel.
right, and there may be an election in America. Right, but the fact that we would wonder about such things tells you that there are erosions and things that we thought had been settled.
Yeah.
That's why there are people, right? There were 7 million Americans in various different streets around the country who were screaming about no kings because they're anxious about the authoritarian drift that they see in the administration. You can say there is no authoritarian drift, he's just actually doing something good for the country. I'm not here to argue that. The fact is, you had the largest outpouring of American political sentiment ever last Saturday, in terms of American numbers. That tells you there's anxiety. And so, have those anxieties, how do you resolve them? He would tell you this thing called hope. The Hebrew word for hope is what? Tikva, right? Now, it's interesting, tikva, the Hebrew word tikva, is actually means a cord. So if you read the book of Joshua, how many of you read the book of Joshua? Congratulations, great book, strongly encourage it. The story is Joshua sends spies to go check out the city of Jericho. And these spies get caught. And they run into the house of a harlot named Rahab. And they say to her, hide us. If anybody asks if we're here, tell them there's no one here. And when we conquer you, we will reward you. And she says, I believe you. So if you promise to take care of me and my family, when the time comes, I'll protect you, which they do. Okay, and what they say to her is they say, look, when we attack and invade the city, hide or hang a scarlet cord out the window of your home, and we'll know that's the one that we need to save. And she says, deal. So that cord is called the Tikva Hashani. Okay, and why is the same word for hope the same word as cord? Because hope is a cord that gives you a lifeline to the future. Jeremiah describes God as Mikveh Israel, which means the hope of Israel. Now, what do we also call a mikveh? A ritual pool. What's the connection between hope and a ritual pool? These are all the same words. This is why Hebrew is cool, and this is why he's writing a book all about letters, which we'll get to in a moment, or in a week. Just right, Rabbi Akiva says, just as a mikveh purifies the impure, so does the Holy One purify Israel. So hope is a thread, he writes, attaching us to the future, and a comforting pool in which we immerse, right? Which provides us with solace, purification, and regeneration. So hope does two things. One is it regenerates, it restores, it heals, it purifies. And hope also draws you into a future that is beset with anxiety. And the challenge that he's trying to face as a thinker is, how do I articulate a vision of Judaism that pulls people to the future with moral clarity, that gives us solace, purification, and regeneration? What does that Judaism look like? And that's his project. There's more beautiful things that he writes about hope. This gives you a sense of him too. Someone want to read this where it says, hope is thus?
I don't know.
Go ahead.
Hope is not only a thin line. It is also a nourishing pool. It is that which links person to person and generation to generation. Hope is life itself. The comic has its own version of the adage that where there is life, there is hope. The activist and entrepreneur,
His name is Maozi Non.
whose parents were murdered in October 7th, 2023, teaches that hope is not a feeling that I wait for, I make hope. Hope is a communal endeavor, something we create together. The thread must be woven, the pool must be dug. In good Jewish tradition, the work has been sparked by anxiety. In equally typical fashion, it draws upon resources of hope and strives to find a thread, a lead, a clue. Anxiety is a drain, while hope is a wellspring. Anxiety insists, hope inspires.
So his point is that anxiety is the engine that drives thought forward. Why do you do Jewish theology? Why do you have to create a thing called modern Jewish thought? Why did he spend most of his life writing this book?
Because he's worried about the
Be-
future.
Because he wants to articulate an answer that provides hope to the anxieties of all the things that are going on in the world in which we live, not just today, but other days. Mao Zedong, who, as he writes here, lost his family on October 7th, has been spending the last 2 years touring the world with a Palestinian partner who's from Gaza, who also lost family, and said, you're in mourning and I'm in mourning, and yet you and I are both committed to a vision where people in Gaza are living happy, productive lives alongside Israel, who are living happy, productive lives, in which we are living not only alongside each other in peace, but collaborating for the future. And we both have lost too much to let go of this dream. So what we're going to look at a little bit next time is this whole question of what is Jewish theology? And Jewish theology in and of itself, this idea that we're just going to talk about the God piece of Judaism as opposed to the entirety, is also a new thing, right? Because Judaism wasn't just a ritual tradition. It wasn't just a theological answer to who or what is God. It was a whole cosmological system of how does the world work? The idea that you could break apart these things is something that happens in the academy. How do you know that something happens in the academy? There's an ology attached to it, right? So you go to the academy and there are all these different departments of study, as if the human condition can be broken out into biology, anthropology, sociology, theology, right? Human beings are not generally well broken into parts in the way that the academy breaks things into departments, but such is how we do intense study. And so, if you think about the Torah, or the Talmud, are they spending a lot of time telling you what God is?
No.
No, there's a chapter here, a chapter there. In the entirety of the 39 books of the Bible, how many describe what God looks like? 2 chapters? One at the
Or in
first
English.
beginning of the book of Ezekiel, and the other at the 6th chapter of the book of Isaiah. That's pretty much it, right? In the Talmud, how much time do they spend telling you about God? Almost none. What are they talking about?
Halacha,
Yeah, my ox gores your cow, what do we do?
how you like.
Right? If it's Shabbat, but I'm on a ship, what do I do? If it's Shabbat and if it's Sukkot and I'm on a ship, what do I do? Can I build a sukkah on the ship? Yes, you can.
Yeah.
And in fact, the way that they determine how strong a sukkah is supposed to be is that it can't be strong enough to withstand the kinds of winds you face at sea.
Can't be strong.
Can't be strong enough to withstand the kinds of winds you face at sea. And there's a whole piece about that. And so he quotes Shai Cherry, who writes, rabbinic religiosity did not foreground theology. No single theology was universally accepted when Jews did begin theology. The church might begin to be. Theology as a discrete discipline was not a distinct category for Jews until modernity. And the gap between studying traditional texts and writing Jewish theology has still not been bridged. In other words, anytime someone's writing theology, they're always going back to the text. Because what it is to do Jewish theology is to live in dialogue with all of the other elements of Jewish culture and society, which include Jewish law, Jewish practice, Jewish food, Jewish culture, Jewish history, Jewish peoplehood, etc. And how you weave all that together is kind of what Jewish theologians do. And so next time we're going to look at some of the different kinds of theology that he's playing with and what he's going to try to answer in his book. And hope everybody has a nice week.
There's something tonight, right? There's like. Yes, there's something.
There may be things that I'm not sure what